I'm Valerie Cassell-Oliver. I am the Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, and on behalf of our Director, Alex Nargis, and the board of the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, I'd like to welcome you here to tonight's program, The Power of Portraiture, with our wonderful Dr. Rhea Combs, who's come down from Washington, D.C. I am so pleased to present our featured speaker this evening, who's not only an amazing scholar and teacher and curator, but a dear, dear friend, Rhea Combs. I think we have known each other since we both lived in D.C. in the 90s. It's a way back moment. But it's a moment that continues to yield through constant conversation. But my friend and scholar, Dr. Rhea Combs, I just want to read a little bit about her. She is Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., and prior to that was at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where she served as the curator of film and photography, as well as the head of the Earl W. and Amanda Stafford Center for African American Media Arts. She received her bachelor's from Howard University, that's where I went to school too, and a master's of art degree from Cornell University, and a doctorate from Emory University in Atlanta. Her writings have been featured through anthologies, academic journals, exhibition catalogs, including The Dirty South, on topics that range from African American female filmmakers, popular culture, Black popular culture, and visual aesthetics, as well as filmmaking and photography. At the National Museum of History and Culture, she organized many exhibitions, including the museum's inaugural photography show, Everyday Beauty, selections from photography and film collection, Rising Up, Hal Woodruff's murals at Talladega College, Through the African American Lens, selections from the permanent collection of the museum, as well as inaugurated a series of books called The African American Lens, or Double Exposure, which included focuses on civil rights and the struggle for equality, African American women, picturing children, and fighting for freedom, as well as represent hip-hop photography. And then finally, the exciting one, Watching Oprah, the Oprah Winfrey Show, and American culture. She has been a professor. She's taught things such as visual culture, film, race, and gender at universities like Chicago State University, Lewis and Clark College, and Emory as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Rhea Combs.
Good evening, and thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it. It's a true honor to be here. I would like to thank those who are here physically, and as well as recognize those who are on live stream, and I appreciate all the support that has been brought to the museum to make the live stream possible. I also would like to thank the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and everyone who helped to make this program possible. I recognize that these events require support from people in all different areas. And so I want to acknowledge all of those who have had a hand in bringing this program to fruition this evening. It's an honor to be discussing a thinker like Frederick Douglass in a state of Virginia and looking at the power of portraiture as part of a program connected to the exhibition deftly curated by my friend and colleague Valerie Cassell-Oliver, Sir Isaac Julien's 10-channel poetic installation, Lessons of the Hour. I encourage all who may not have experienced this work to sit with it. It's a beautiful display and speculative portrait of one of the most preeminent thinkers of the 19th century. This evening, I will discuss Douglass and his sphere of influence and some of the ways in which his, what I call to action through the art of imagery, if you will, has deep resonances. A word of caution that some of the images may be a bit disturbing for some, so I would like to just sort of provide that forewarning before we get going. Let's see, not this image though. The elder statesman, orator, anti-slavery activist was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey in February 1818 in Talbot County on the eastern shore of Maryland to Harriet Bailey, an enslaved woman. His father, however, is unknown, but speculations are that his father was him and his mother's white owner, Aaron Anthony. Douglass was taught to read at a young age, and while laboring on the plantation or whenever he was leased out, he often attempted to teach other enslaved persons how to read. Activism, in other words, was in his DNA. He successfully escaped enslavement in 1838 at age of 20 with the assistance of his future wife of 44 years and mother of his 5 children, Anna Murray. She sold a feather bed to help him escape north, where he moved to New York and changed his surname to Johnson. After marrying Anna, they relocated to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he then changed his name to Douglass with 2 S's. The Douglass was based upon a character from Sir Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake. He was a fugitive for 9 years before his freedom was purchased with the help of his British patrons for the amount of about $711, which has a value today of about $28,170. Douglass would eventually move his family to, Douglass would eventually move his family to Rochester, New York, where he started the anti-slavery paper, the North Star, the longest-running Black-owned newspaper of the 19th century. He met and advised President Abraham Lincoln and met every subsequent president up to Grover Cleveland. He began his career 2 decades before the North and South would divide and fight a civil war over slavery, a battle he openly welcomed, and he played a pivotal role in what historian David Blight called America's apocalypse, the Civil War. Over the course of more than 6 decades, Douglass published 3 autobiographies, hundreds of essays, and a novella. He delivered thousands of speeches, both nationally and abroad. Scholars have reported that along with Mark Twain, he may have been one of the most widely or the most widely traveled American public figure of his century. Keeping this in mind, that he was taking photographs, he was documenting his condition while illegally, essentially a fugitive for almost 10 years. So again, this sort of sense of agitate, bravery, daring is something that he also would then bring to his photographs and the way in which he chose to present himself. And it reverberates. He was the first African American to receive a federal appointment requiring Senate approval, the U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia. And I just want to sort of give a pause and make sure that it's really recognized that while he was able to do this, be the most traveled, sort of one of the forward thinkers, one of the considered one of the most important orators of the golden age of lecturing. He was able to do this by the support of his unwavering wife, Anna Murray, and the fact that, again, he was able to accomplish so many things, but scholars have said he was not necessarily self-made. He definitely had the support of others to make that success possible. And it is not to be sort of dismissed or discounted that one of those others that helped to make it possible was his wife, his first wife. As scholars John Stauffer, Zoe Tride, and Celeste Marie Berner stated in the book Picturing Frederick Douglass, Douglass was in love with photography. He was a proponent of modernity, in fact. During the 4 years of the Civil War, he wrote more extensively on photography than any other American, despite the fact that most people were more enthralled by the war, and knowing him as this huge anti-slavery sort of abolitionist advocate, they wanted to hear his opinions on the mighty struggle, as they called it. He became the most photographed American of the 19th century, totaling more than 160 photographs of himself. And these are distinct poses. So well before, and this is, I always say, well before the advent of cell phones. Nowadays, some people take 160 photos before they leave the house. But, you know, he was outpacing Lincoln, who had 125 images taken of himself, or Sojourner Truth, who had 11 photographs of her, that, again, she used in that same sort of vein of I'm selling the shadow to support the substance. So in addition to describing him, so keeping in mind that at a time when everyone wanted to talk about the war, he's talking about the art of photography, we could add to his sort of resume of orator and abolitionist and statesman, we can add art critic. Douglass first sat for a daguerreotype in 1841. He praised Louis Daguerre, who was the founder of the first popular form of photography, and he praised him because Douglass recognized this art form as what he called a democratic art. In an essay in 1861, Lectures on the Pictures, he explained what was once the special and exclusive luxury of the rich and great is now the privilege of all. And it's important to sort of keep that in mind when you think about sort of the history of portraiture. This was an art form that, you know, often included paintings that sat in these sort of stately homes. They reinforced this sort of notion of class. They were often sort of hailed as opportunities for the rich and famous, landowners, individuals who could vote, to then continue to sort of perpetuate a legacy for their family. And what Douglass is arguing is that photographs, then another form of portraiture, allow the everyday person to have an opportunity to create their own sort of presence in another way. And that becomes sort of an activist sort of agenda that he's bringing forward. And this was pretty sort of revolutionary considerations at the time. He explained, you know, that he believed that photography bore witness to African Americans' essential humanity. And in 1870 explained, we colored men so often see ourselves described and painted as monkeys that we think it is a great piece of good fortune to find an exception to the general rule. And it's true, the presentation of Black images is rooted in the notion of what scholar and theorist Nicole Fleetwood says, a troubling vision. And so 19th and 20th century images located subjects often in relation to physical labor or some other sort of subservient or stereotypical racialized imagining. Advertisements, broadsides, and other modes of propaganda, if you will, actively promulgated racist, stereotypical, and distorted images that unfortunately still resonate. But Douglass, again, believed in the power and potential of photography. He understood that it represented broader American values regarding technology, freedom, and objectivity. Again, as we can see here, he explains daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, photographs, and electrotypes, good and bad, now adorn or disfigure all our dwellings. Men of all conditions may see themselves as others see them. What was once the exclusive luxury of the rich and great is now within reach of all. And it was with that sort of philosophy that he really brought forward this desire to take 160 photographs, of himself, to really allow us a sort of to put a mirror in front of, I guess, America, if you will, the world. He believed that there was a potential power with photography and understood it represented broader American values around technology, again, modernity, as I've already stated, freedom, and objectivity. So despite the fact that touch-ups still did occur with these photographs, it was a practice then as it is now, maybe not as, they didn't have filters like we do. He argued that it created an undeniable ability to recognize humanity because it gave visibility to its subjects that made their personhood undeniable. In other words, the democratic art of photography offered a way for Black people in particular to counterbalance the pervasiveness of those denigrating images I just talked about. So here you can see a range of photographs of Douglass. This first one to my right is a 6-plate that is one of the earliest known images of Douglass. So this is right a few years after he has escaped enslavement. So he's still a fugitive. He's in his 20s. He's very handsome. But he's looking directly, he has this, again, this piercing gaze, this direct face, eyes into the camera. He's dressed in a very distinguished suit. And again, he identified himself as a fugitive slave, but this image then challenges that, because if you're saying someone is not human, that they are, considered chattel, they are property, it's hard to reconcile that belief with an image of someone who looks this distinguished and dignified, and who literally you cannot deny their gaze. That again is a sort of an act of, that again is his sort of subversive act, if you will, of challenging this common notion around sort of perceptions of Black people. And then you see a little older him again in this uniform, if you will, of what he chose to wear. Often a 3-piece suit, a bow tie. He did not want it to be distracted by, floral arrangements in the background or any other necessarily a sort of accoutrement. It was truly sort of a sense of looking at him, his face, his gaze. He's not smiling. It's a very dignified, self-possessed image of Douglass. And so to think about the fact that we have a moment of mechanical reproduction, as Walter Benjamin would say, that you're able to send these images. He would often sign them. He would often put his name and add them with a letter that he was sending. So now he's letting people know he's literate, he's handsome, and he's dignified. But jokes aside, he's providing a real sort of challenge to what the perception of the Black personhood, or the perception of Black people, and it makes it very difficult for people to not sort of recognize his personhood. So these are just sort of 3 images that you can see him as he aged over the years. So again, and Douglass helped to politicize photography, not only by speaking about it or showing images of himself, but he used it when he was referencing the Civil War. For example, he, Oh, before I go to that, I will say this is another image he would use. Again, he's much older, he's with his grandson, Joseph, while he's still looking directly at us. You know, he still has his coif, has his signature beard by now, but if he was showing a fuller image of himself, he often wanted to include some sort of book, newspaper, something to remind people, sort of signify his literacy as well. So again, the photographs become, one may argue, a political act because he's providing these reference points to challenge these, again, sort of mainstream notions of personhood, or who gets to have that privilege. And that being said, when he was talking about the Civil War, he referenced the support of the African-American Senator Hiram Revels, and he explained, whatever may be the prejudices of those who may look upon it, they will be compelled to admit that the Mississippi senator is a man. And so, again, this is why he felt photography was such a critical and important sort of endeavor for us, particularly groups of marginalized individuals, to pursue. Douglass believed that photographs, quote, see what ought to be by the reflection of what is, and endeavor to remove the contradiction. So as Stauffer and his co-editors explained in Picturing Douglass, the sheer number of public portraits of Douglass as a young man, as we saw in 1841, and for the nearly next 6 decades, convey not only his faith in photography, but his understanding of the public identity he was crafting. Some would now call him, in his use of photography, him being an influencer. Photography was also an interracial endeavor. Of the photographs we see of him, some were from individuals, some, as we noted here, were unidentified, but then this one on the far left is from C.M. Batty, who was an African-American photographer who eventually became the photography instructor at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He was also photographed by James Reed, a Boston-based photographer who took at least 3 images of the man, and then James Hiram Easton and J.P. Ball. So Douglass's writings in the 1860s, when most people were expecting him to discuss the Civil War, as we've discussed, he fixated on reminding us that Black Americans have been invested in image creation since the early days of this art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and the struggle for representation remains evergreen. One of the powers of storytelling and visual culture is that it offers a pathway to better understand the people, movements, and moments that have been essential to the growth and development of this nation. So while historical figures like Douglass and Sojourner Truth sort of understood this power, they were not the only ones who sort of used it as a promotional tool to further agendas, to argue against argue against slavery and advocate for other sort of forms of freedom. There's been, photographs, ethnographic, documentary, and avant-garde films that were made. There were filmmakers that were challenged, which my exhibition kind of goes into, that really kind of took on this notion that Frederick Douglass discusses and really tried to create a whole sort of industry of what we call race films that counterbalance many of these pervasive images that were taking place during the time period. But there was this gentleman, J.P. Ball, and he was, again, an early African-American photographer who was born free in 1825 in Frederick County, Virginia, To William and Susan Ball, he learned the art of the daguerreotype by another free man of color, John Bailey. By age of 20, Ball had opened his first photography studio in Cincinnati, Ohio, a city heavily invested in anti-slavery. And unfortunately, that business was short-lived, but Ball's passion for photography was unwavering. He left Ohio and became an itinerant photographer, traveling to various parts of the South and Midwest. And he would set up these equivalents of pop-up shops, if you will. And he eventually returned to Cincinnati for several years. And it's reported that he had one of the, quote, finest photographic galleries west of the Allegheny Mountains. One of his more prominent clients included, as we've discussed, Frederick Douglass, but eventually Ball moved west and established a photography studio with his son, J.P. Ball Jr. And they established this in Helena, Montana, around 1887, where this photograph was taken. The name of the studio lacked no irony. It's aptly called J.P. Ball and Son. And again, these sort of, I think, on-the-nose gestures are another sort of moment for inserting one's humanity in a conversation and in a society that often was trying to negate that. So considering that Douglass and photography and even museum practice allow us to consider parts of American history, or we hope museum practice will allow us to consider parts of American history that may be lesser known, it's nevertheless, all of these things are critical to our understanding of who and whose nation this is. So seeing images of people during a time of deep racial divide, seeing images of people like this during times of deep racial divide serve as glimpses of human self-reliance, self-determination, dignity, and dare say creativity during some of our bleakest moments. So in our presently, we are bombarded with images and information. If you consider sort of the shifting technologies and access to various images that we have now, this deliberate act of documenting oneself during or through photography, when, dare say, resources may have been limited, financial choices had to be made, it becomes even more critical to sort of understand how sort of relevant photography has been for, sort of society. And so when I look at this image, and I, acquired this image in 2013 for the African American Museum, I was just struck by this unknown woman, and we've tried to figure out who she is. We've studied the sort of the armament on her collar, but just the style of dress, this choice of material, the sort of Victorian, the bellowing of the sleeves, which is in style now, just really, to me, was just so striking. She just looks, she's beautiful, but again, her face, she's not smiling. She's looking off with this sort of distant gaze. But there's, again, a self-possession. There's a dignity. There is a pride in how she chose to look, but also sort of her demeanor. And this was what J.P. Ball was doing. He became extremely popular in the state of Montana. I also found this image really striking because when people think of Helena, Montana, I don't think they think of Black people. So having this here really sort of allows us to have a broader understanding of the nation and of, recognizing, as they often say, African American history is American history. All of that, there is an sort of dependency, and that our worlds, again, when you think about the fact that there were so many individuals, white and black, who photographed Frederick Douglass, that these companies like J.P. Ball and Son, the Goodrich brothers, many other young Augustus Washington, from early photographer, there were many photographers who were African American who had businesses. They could not only rely on the African American community, they obviously had to have this sort of integrated, it was an integrated sort of business, if you will, at a time of deep segregation. I think that that's also a sort of very interesting insight about sort of the art of, about this art form. Again, very different from sort of portraiture, traditional portraits and paintings that were often regulated for a very elite class. So, you know, when you think about J.P. Ball, he became very successful in Helena. He was part of the political machine. In fact, him and his son were, you know, they were encouraging black families to move to the area. His son started a newspaper called The Colored Citizen, where in the first issue, published in September of 1894, he wrote, "It cannot be denied that our people, through force of circumstance, occupy a particular status in this country. We are not thoroughly known. Our better qualities are not presented fairly to the public." So they use this this paper and their business to really sort of create an opportunity for artists, for citizens and black citizens, in fact, to become really sort of involved in Helena. It was, in fact, the African Americans that were they had a political campaign that centered race as an important part of the discussion that allowed Helena to become the sort of capital of Montana. And it was through J.P. Ball and through his son's efforts and through community activism and through sort of, you know, his business as a photographer that allowed this sort of, that interconnected politics and art. And so, unfortunately, the Balls were eventually, through all of this activism, eventually forced out of town. For documenting and creating a multi-series of photographs of a fellow Montanan named William Biggerstaff and printing this work in the paper. Not much is known about Mr. Biggerstaff, except that he was born enslaved in 1854 in Lexington, Kentucky. He was convicted of killing Dick Johnson, a prominent local prize fighter, after an argument that occurred on June 9th in 1895. Biggerstaff argued self-defense. After a trial and even a temporary stay of execution, Mr. Biggerstaff was hanged on April the 6th in 1896. Ball chose to create a series of images that showed Biggerstaff sitting for a photo in the studio. Then he showed him hanging from a rope with men next to him. And then, and these were the Reverend Victor Day to his right and Sheriff Henry Juergens at his left. He then showed him lying in his coffin. I was struck by the fact that in every image he's in the same three-piece suit that he wore in this original studio portrait. But with the lynching photograph and the coffin image they both show him wearing his wedding ring, a small image, a small symbol, immediately makes me wonder, who did he leave behind? Was it that woman, perhaps? His story is already so tragic, but it serves as what Roland Barthes would call a punctum, an indelible impression. And through these images, the framing of the photographs, that scholars have argued and what Douglass knew all along, we see Bickerstaff humanized, and Ball understood that. He understood photography as a political act. Placing it in the newspaper, a triptych just like this, is literally what got him run out of town. Having a Black person document this also, having J.P. Ball, mind you, he was extremely fair-skinned, I must admit, but I think based on the newspaper, his politics, he was African-American and identified as such. Having him document this moment dismantles some of the other misperceptions that we have, that all of these sort of documents that we have of heinous crimes were taken by white photographers. This sort of challenges that notion. It demonstrates also how Ball wanted to foreground Bickerstaff's citizenry, if you will, his personhood. It's difficult to look at this work and also not make the connections with cell phone culture of today that has too often recorded one of America's citizens having their life end too shortly, abruptly, or through execution. So Black authored works, be it photography or films, are sort of generative in terms of what they can tell us, not only about authorship, about self-definitions, aesthetic value, but they retell histories that may have been overlooked. Another example would be of this gentleman by the name of Addison Scurlock. This is bringing you to Washington, D.C. From 1904 to 1994, Addison Scurlock and his sons, Robert and George, shared 9 decades of photographing Black life in Washington, D.C. Because of their love, dedication, and commitment to the craft, they became beloved by the community, just like J.P. Ball was in Montana. They became loved because of depicting Black people and places. This is Addison as he had just arrived in Washington, D.C. From North Carolina with his family, who also were run out of town around 1898 after the sort of riots of 1898 in North Carolina. His father wanted to be an attorney, and he had 3 children. Addison was one of them. He had another son and a daughter. She became a teacher. His brother was a doctor. They lived in a very sort of middle-class neighborhood in DC near Howard University. But he always knew he wanted to be a photographer. Archival research that I've done show that he literally understood, again, Douglass's sort of call, his clarion call for understanding what photography did for sort of the representation of Black people. And so this young age, he was apprenticing with a Canadian photographer who had a business in Washington, D.C. named Moses Rice. And this is one of the earliest images that we have of him as he had just moved to D.C. His family, again, they had this very established business for 90 years in Washington, and it was for decades. They photographed individuals, families, groups, businesses at weddings. They became so popular that there was a phrase that if you did not have the Scurlocks take your wedding picture, you may not have gotten married. So because of segregation and a fear of not being able to establish a large customer base on Pennsylvania Avenue, which was at the time called Photographers Row, they operated their business in their family business in the midst of historic Black neighborhoods surrounding U Street and Howard University in Washington, Northwest Washington, D.C., which was often called Black Broadway. U Street was considered the nexus of Black culture, art, business, and intellect, second only to Harlem on the East Coast. People shopped on this thoroughfare. They found refuge in the local pubs, theaters, enjoyed vibrant communities whose identity were made even more pronounced by the hundreds of thousands of photographs created by the Scurlocks. So again, you see graduations, family photographs, again, creating, again, this sense of humanity. Though his business existed a short distance from the White House and the Capitol, segregation imposed a racial divide in Washington, D.C. throughout most of the 20th century. So again, as I mentioned, Addison honed his career through a 3-year apprenticeship with Moses Rice. And again, one could argue why, sort of how that even came to be. And oftentimes I think speculation was just because Rice was Canadian, maybe he just didn't understand all of the issues that were going on. But it was a wonderful opportunity for Scurlock, and he was able to really craft his skills at sort of retouching, which became one of his sort of signature moves. A portrait from Rice Studio, I've shown you, sort of looks as though it could have been included, if you will, if we could go back to it. It could be included in the W.E.B. Du Bois's presentation of the 1900 Paris Exposition, which was the landmark exhibit that showed the small nation within a nation striving and achieving. So despite years of discrimination and white supremacy, this cabinet card of a dapper and clear-eyed Addison with this floral display in the background sort of matches and was consistent with the aesthetic approach taken by many other Black photographers, or photographers, if you will, of this period. And as mentioned, he became this sort of resident photographer. He was the key photographer for Howard University, and so many other individuals. W.E.B. Du Bois, again, had his photographs taken by Scurlock and his family, but then his sons followed in his footsteps. And Robert Scurlock, and so you can see here, him in his studio. He was extremely sort of personable and a perfectionist in the way in which he took his images, and his sons followed in his footsteps. And this image of Marian Anderson on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial illustrates Robert's deftness at blending his father's training in portraiture with his own experience and his own desires in photojournalism. They were all residents of the Black middle class, and they refused to be defined or held captive by sort of the tenets of segregation and discrimination. They established a business that actually President Kennedy's wife attended. She was a student of theirs. She learned photography, took photography classes with the Scurlocks. So again, they were a hugely influential family within the district. Again, widely known for dignified, mature, and sophisticated images of their Black sitters. The Scurlock Studio expanded upon and pursued multiple avenues of photography, and creating, again, portraits of an entire city, if you will. So this powerful alchemy which fused their artistry with business and love for community and politics, again, all fold back to, I think, ideals and ideas that Douglass was positing in the 1860s and on and beyond. And this notion of sort of the power of portraiture begs our attention because it provides us, I think, with a compelling look into the dynamic and changing nature of Black art and aesthetics and the decades-long work and legacy of so many that have come before us. And following in the tradition of Douglass, an examination of the Scurlocks' work and its impact on the Black Washingtonians, for example, show how photography can serve as this mode of not only representation, but intervention. Their work, the work of Addison and his sons, often sort of offered a counter-narrative that transformed, similar to what Douglass' efforts were doing, they transformed historical images of Blackness and Jim Crow era depictions of African American life. Examining the cultural and aesthetic significance of the Scurlocks' just sheer output allows us a greater understanding of their work. 90 years, a single business. It situates their artistic practice within, again, a pantheon of other Black photographers who during the late 19th and early to mid 20th century showcased aspects of Black life that resonate beyond the boundaries of the nation's capital. They are part of a canon of other photographers like Thomas Askew, J.P. Ball, as we've discussed, Batty, who we've discussed, the Goodrich brothers, P.H. Polk, Augustus Washington, and they understood that they understood this role as more than just, a selfie. This was really about taking these images and having them resonate so that we could be in a conversation today, if you will. I firmly believe and know that and understand that their charge was something that they felt, again, was sort of a race endeavor. This was bigger than just an individual act. And that they were helping to shape people's ideas about beauty, identity, and selfhood. And this approach, if you will, can also be seen in the work of New York-based photographer James Van Der Zee. Like Scurlock, Van Der Zee became famous for his extensive documentation of the Black community in and around Harlem in the mid to late the 1900s, the teens. He was where Scurlock was the designated photographer for Howard University. Van Der Zee was the designated photographer for Marcus Garvey's UNIA. He was busy presenting Black life in New York as urbane, dignified culture, and so this was happening up and down the East Coast. Other photographers throughout the country were doing that. The Goodrich brothers were in Saginaw, Michigan, for instance. So they, again, understood this not merely as a commercial enterprise and not a self-indulgent enterprise, but a rebuttal to larger conversations. And so I will close with a personal photograph of my great-grandmother. This is Fanny Bell Martin Shackelford, and it is my understanding, and sometimes I just look and I stare at this photograph. It clearly predates me, and when I was gifted this photograph by my mother, I was struck by the resemblance of, my family, but it also, again, reminds me of Frederick Douglass in terms of the aesthetic, the style, the sartorial choices, the direct gaze, and the lack of a smile, in fact, that sort of sense of dignity and self-possession and clarity of her direction and approach that she was going to take. And she was the matriarch of our family. I find that it's even more beautiful when you look at the sort of tear on the side, the sort of wear and the ages of the sort of the accretions, the folds, the stains, these become metaphors for me in terms of African American history and culture and people in particular, and how despite all of the tears and the rips and the sort of stains, we still persevere, we still push forward, and we still hold our heads up high, our eyes are directly on the prize, and we will prevail. Thank you.